If you guys are looking into using some flashes, there are a few things you need to learn about this guy first. Hey guys, welcome to Phlearn. My name's Aaron Nace. You can find me on Twitter at @AKNacer. Phlearn's a family built to helping you get better at Photoshop and photography and lighting and everything else in the world. So today we're talking about this guy, basically just some camera settings. You're gonna zoom into that in all of its beautiful glory. It's nice, right? We're talking about the camera settings you guys need to use for on-camera flashes. Can you zoom out, Amelia, so they can see like the softbox? This is basically what we're talking about, using strobes and things like that. And if you guys are taking the jump to start using some off-camera lighting, strobes, whether it's Speedlights or these bigger guys with softbox and things like that on them, there are a couple things you guys should probably know about using, having to do with the camera before you start using these. That's going to help your lives out a little bit easier. The first thing I want to talk about is sync speed. Basically, what this means is the shutter speed. So sync speed has to do with your shutter speed. This is the shutter speed that's acceptable when using these kinds of lights. So in this extremely ghetto example of how a shutter works, I've got two pieces of cardboard. I know, it's very fancy, right? But it'll help get the point across. So the pretend like my face is basically the sensor. My face is what captures the light. And what we have to remember is like this is over time. So your camera, most cameras anyway, have two curtains in them. And what happens is the first curtain comes down. So if they're right up here, your first curtain is going to come down and start exposing your film. There we go, just like that. And depending on how long your shutter speed is, your second curtain comes down and finishes it off. So if you have like a 1 second exposure where it's just like click, open, and then bonk, close, then that's totally cool. And it gives this flashes that you're using time enough to actually expose your film. But if you guys are using something a little bit faster, what happens is these guys don't necessarily go like super fast. If you're using like 1/6000, what they do instead is they just get closer together. So as they go down and they're getting closer together, just like right over here, like it only exposes part of the film, and as they move down, the space in between them exposes part of the film. So if you think about that over time, basically it's like the area that gets exposed just doesn't really get exposed for that long. Like if you had a whole exposure, like this, the part in the middle would get exposed over this entire duration of the two curtains moving down. But if it's like this, it's only going to get exposed for a very small fraction of time. So that's basically an extremely ghetto example of how your curtains work. One comes down and then another one comes down. So this is important when you guys are using off-camera flashes. And the reason it's important is because if you were using a shutter speed that's too fast, what's going to happen is your first curtain is going to come down, and then as your second curtain is coming down, you're going to take a picture, and you're only exposing part of the picture when the flash occurs, and that part is going to be lit by the flash. But the other parts, wherever these curtains are, those are actually going to be black because they're actually covering your sensor, like they're in movement when your camera flashes. So to be safe, you just have to use a shutter speed that's a little bit slower than you might normally choose. And it totally depends on cameras, and it totally depends on the technology that cameras use. If you guys are using like a super fancy, like a medium format camera, you probably already know everything that I'm saying anyway. A lot of those use leaf shutters, or like an iPhone, for instance, uses the leaf shutter, or like a Canon G10 or G11 or G12. Those kind of cameras use a different type of shutter. They don't have the two curtains. It's just one of these guys that goes like this. So the sync speed you can use for those is a little bit faster. But when you guys are using, like most digital SLRs use just, front curtain and then rear curtain shutters. So you're going to be limited with your shutter sync speed with those. And a lot of Nikons sync up to about like 250 of the second. So that's 1/250. And most Canons don't really go that far. I have the 5D Mark II, and it's rated to 1/160, I think, or maybe even 1/200, but I get most of my luck right over 1/160 or 1/125. So that's about as fast as you want to go with it. Now, you can go anywhere slower than that, and just remember, it's like, as long as it has time to close, you're totally cool. But if you go faster than that, you're going to see those black bars, and those black bars are basically just your actual curtains that you're seeing in your exposure. So the next thing I want to talk about, guys, is your white balance. Now, the tough part to think about when you guys are using these off-camera flashes is that your camera doesn't technically know that they exist, right? Because it sees what's going on in the ambient. And you can get auto white balance just fine if the camera's like looking around and it can judge the light values and things like that. But the flashes only happen when the shutter's actually open, right? And the camera's not taking in any real information there. It's not like metering or anything like that. So the reason why you have to use a white balance that's basically set for your flashes is because the camera really doesn't know they exist, and it can't predict the white balance for the flashes. Now, most cameras will actually have, you can see this here, there we go. Can you zoom into that, Amelia? As long as you guys can see it. Most cameras are gonna have a flash white balance, and this is probably right around 5600 degrees Kelvin, and this is a pretty good one to use. You can use a custom, like right around it. You know, if you want to use 5900 degrees Kelvin, you can do that too. But usually when I'm using flashes, I'll shoot in 5600 degrees Kelvin, which is just a little flash symbol, and that's going to ensure that your flash actually looks normal. If you guys are using auto white balance and you use these flashes, most of the time it's going to come out looking a little bit too cool because the flashes are a different color temperature than the light around you guys. So that's another important thing you guys need to keep in mind when you're using these flashes. I always shoot in RAW, so the white balance isn't as important, but get it pretty right if you can. White balance you can change after the fact in RAW, but it's always better to get it right. The last thing I want to talk about when dealing with the camera is shooting in manual, and the reason this is important, the same reason why it's important with white balance, is when these flashes occur, the camera's not taking in any information. So if you're shooting in something like aperture priority, basically your camera's, you know, using a light meter in here, you can zoom into there, it's basically trying to figure out what's going on with the light in your scene. You can set your aperture and then it'll adjust your shutter speed for you based on how much light is in your scene. But these flashes occur, there we go, in just a very brief second, or you know, like sometimes a very small fraction of a second. So that being the case, you can't really rely on the meter that's in the camera to see like these flashes, because it doesn't see them, and it only sees them when you guys are firing during the actual exposure. So kind of have to shoot in manual mode. Now you can shoot in aperture priority, but I always shoot in manual. So a good setting, if you guys are in the studio, I just leave my shutter speed right around 1/125 or 1/160, and that's just going to ensure that it's a pretty fast shutter speed, so the lights, like the ambient lights in the studio, aren't really going to affect your exposure, and you're going to be sure to sync with these guys. Now, the only thing that's really important when using off-camera flashes like this is your aperture. Your shutter speed really doesn't matter that much as long as it syncs, because shutter speed is for ambient light and your aperture is for these strobes. And we'll get into that later. But you want to make sure you set your, all right, we're going to go to manual mode. There we go. Okay, so we're at 1/125th, we're at f5 and ISO 100. So this is totally normal settings for an in-studio flash. If you guys are shooting in manual, just make sure you're shooting at a low ISO. That's the whole point of using strobes, is because they provide a lot of light, so you don't have to really crank your ISO up. So stay at ISO 100 or 200 if you can. Now your shutter speed, if you guys are in the studio again, that can stay up at around 1/125, 1/160. You don't need it to be any slower than that, so why make it slower than that? And your aperture, that is dependent on the lights that you use. So you can either chimp it, which means you take a picture with your aperture, you know, just guess and see if it looks too bright or too dark and adjust it from there. If it does not look right, you can also use a light meter, and that's gonna just tell you exactly what your aperture is, and that's what I prefer to do. So can we get a light meter, and then we'll just test this light, and then we'll figure out what that looks like. So with my ISO at 100 and our shutter speed at 1/125, I'm gonna hit this button on the side, and we're gonna talk about pocket wizards and radio transmitters. 1 second, but this is going to take a reading, and right now it's telling me that my aperture needs to be f13. So I'm going to change the aperture on my camera till we get f13. There we go. And then I'm going to take a picture of myself, because I don't need anyone's help. I can do it all by myself. And I'm sure that, oh God, it's horrible. We're not going to show you that one. But that's it for using your camera with these strobes. Now the last thing I want to talk about, guys, it's actually nothing to do with your camera. It's got something to do instead with the things you put on top of your camera, and that's where these come in. This is a pocket wizard. Basically, it's a radio transmitter. It sends a signal from your camera. When you take a picture, it sends a signal from your camera to one of these guys, and you need one on your light as well, and that tells the light to flash when you're taking the picture, and then it's gonna sync through that. So this is probably the most expensive option as far as radio transmitter work. I own these because, to be honest, I went through the eBay trigger thing. Like, I can link to this stuff below, but I went through eBay triggers, and then I was like on a real shoot, and they just completely failed on me. Like, they weren't syncing, and my client was like, well, what's going on? And I was like, my radio transmitters aren't working. And they were like, well, I don't care. this is like a real shoot. So like that was like a real slap in the face, like, yeah, obviously I can't ruin the shoot because I cheaped out on my radio transmitter. So I have these Pocket Wizards. They're expensive, but they work every single time. Now there are some other brands. There's like Radio Poppers, Cyber Syncs, and other L-Incom Skyports. Some of those didn't even exist when I started buying my radio transmitters, but I have like 6 or 7 of these. This one in particular has fallen into 2 rivers. This one has fallen into 2 rivers. So the things on the top don't work anymore, but the rest of it still does work. So do they work? Yes, they do, even if they've fallen into rivers. So get some of these guys. If you don't feel like spending the money on these, the Cyber Syncs work pretty well. The Radio Poppers actually work really well too. But this is what I would recommend over anything like IR or anything. You definitely want to go with a radio transmitter, and this is what I use. That's all you guys really need to know about using a camera with off-camera flashes. It's going to work the same if you guys use these with Speedlights, if you guys use these with white lightnings, if you're using them with pro photos, anything like that. You just have to make sure you're shooting in manual mode. You want to be sure your white balance is set to a custom white balance or it's set to flash, and you want to be sure that you're using a sync speed that actually allows your lights to hit your sensor and not get in the way of those little curtains. Guys, thanks so much for watching Phlearn. If you guys have anything to add, did I forget anything? Did I miss anything? Is there other cool stuff that everyone should know about the camera? Let us know. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.